We don't see any definition of the moving subject. That's also a very good example. So let's get our cameras out and do a quick test using what we've learned. This will prepare us to complete the Motion Study 1 assignment. Stop the video here so you can do that. Okay, now we're going to do the part 2 of the motion assignment. There's 4 shots on one screen. And in these 4 photos, we're going to be using the shutter priority mode on our cameras. That could be S for Nikon or TV for Canon. This will allow you to choose the shutter speed, and then the f-stop will compensate. If you're comfortable with the P mode, you could stay in the P mode. You can still achieve these results with the P mode. We're really concentrating on the shutter. So what we're going to do is the upper left, we're going to hold the camera still as a moving subject passes. We do not follow the subject with our camera. And the slow shutter speed, holding the camera still, the shutter speed is about between 1/4 and 1/15 of a second. It's going to show a very still foreground and background with a motion subject. And then we're going to do a fast shutter speed, also holding the camera still, and we'll use between 125th and an 800th of a second. Now this pretty much is similar to the previous part 1 of this assignment. Now this is where it changes. We're going to do a slow shutter speed, but we're going to pan with the subject. And again, we're going to do it at 1/4 of a second to a 1/15th of a second. And you'll see that the background is blurry, but the subject is sharp. When I say panning, we're following the action of the subject and keeping the subject in our frame. So we're moving, we're following the subject with our camera. We're going to do that same panning technique, following the subject with our camera with a faster shutter speed, and between 125th and a 2/50th of a second. So you'll see that even though we're moving our camera and following the subject, the background is less blurred. Part 2 of the motion study assignment is to give the photographer the understanding of how motion in a photo changes when using different shutter speeds. The one on the left is 125th of a second. The one on the right, I believe, was a 15th of a second. And they're both panning shots, following the subject with the camera. This photo was taken at a slow shutter speed, about a 15th of a second, as the camera was following the subject, panning with the subject. Very, very nice blurred background. It's a really great effect. If your panning is poorly timed, you'll miss the subject. You want to keep the subject in the frame at all times. One way to practice panning when you're first getting started is to pan with your subject as they run circles around you, and that makes it easier to keep them in the frame. Try to get your subject framed as close as the boy on the scooter from about the waist up, and take shots and at the fastest and the slowest possible shutter speed. That's what we're doing in part 2 of this assignment. And here is a diagram. I've got these kids running around me in a circle, so they're really never getting closer or further away from the camera, and I'm able to keep them in the frame, and I just click, 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 click. Sometimes the lighting is good, sometimes it's bad, but it allows me to change my shutter speed and still keep them in the frame for these examples. This is a common Hollywood technique, this panning technique. You'll also hear it as a carousel setup. You'll see the same trees pass behind the riders because the camera is on a lazy Susan or a carousel. The camera is panning with the subject. The carousel technique duplicates the effect of the photographer shooting from the center of a merry-go-round carousel. This is another great way to get a blurred background. This, in essence, is kind of a hybrid panning technique. And the reason I like this photo is the subject is facing the sun, so her face is very well lit up. It's important to lead the subject for best results. This is done by being slightly ahead of the subject, so you see their face while they're running past the camera, and that's leaving a little more space in front of the subject so they have a place to go. Now, which way should you have your subject be traveling? Here is someone going from right to left, and here's someone going from left to right. Typically in Western civilization, since we read from left to right, we're more comfortable with photographing motion going from left to right. But sometimes you can't control that. It's just if you have the option to set it up, just do the one that you're most comfortable with. Most people will agree, if they live in places that they read left to right, they'll like this setup better than this one. Now, show some of the subject's face. Have the subject travel toward the light so their face is bright. That's critical in getting a really good panning shot. That shot on the right, that's actually me when I was probably in the 5th or 6th grade. My brother was a pretty good photographer. Maybe he was about 15 when he took that picture for high school. Motion blur with a slow shutter speed can be a good effect from both high and low angles. And many great sports shots are taken from low angles. Here's one where it's a blurred action, and here's one with it's a very fast shutter speed at a low angle. This is a good shot, but the camera isn't following the action, so it's not panning. To achieve panning, the camera needs to follow the subject. Now, what happens with these different combinations? This is another example shot by a student. The faster shutter speed stops the action, like in the upper left, and with slower shutter speeds, you'll get a larger aperture, and that's what we're seeing in the upper left. We're at f2, very large aperture, and it stops the action and it blurs the background. In the lower right, we have a slow shutter speed, 1/4 of a second, and the background is in sharp focus because we're using f16. This is why the same amount of light entering the camera will have different effects. We call this blurring and sharpening of the background the control of the depth of field, and that'll be a subject that we'll get into next week. I just want to kind of prime it for you. So when the subject is coming toward you or going away from you, the blurring effect doesn't show up because the subject isn't moving across the area of view. In this photo, the kid is running very fast, but he's running towards the camera point of view. So he's just getting slightly bigger, but he's not streaking past the camera. In the example below, note that the path of the runner, he's traveling across the sensor from left to right. This setup is better for showing motion, as evidenced in the lower right photo. So now let's talk about the motion study 3, the assignment 3, and that is tracking with your subject. And that is very different than panning with your subject. So we're going to do 2 shots. We are going to track with the subject at a very fast shutter speed, like a 500th of a second, and we're going to track with the subject doing a very slow shutter speed, like a 14th of a second. And when I say tracking, this technique is called tracking. This is accomplished with the camera traveling next to the subject, and the camera and the subject are moving in the same direction at the same speed. Here we see the Tour de France, a camera operator on a motorcycle traveling at the same speed as the racer. And that's very common for a lot of sports. It's called tracking because of the track. There are no smooth roads available when you're shooting on location. So movie crews lay actual track for the camera to travel on for the tracking shots. In the Olympics, there's a few cameras that travel on a track and follow the runners for the entire race. They just travel at the same speed of the runners, and they're operated remotely, and they get these great images. We won't be able to do this with tracking. It's just too hard to set up. But tracking shots, even if you're traveling with a kid, you can get a very good look if they're enhanced with Photoshop or with the blur effect. This is my oldest grandchild. She's a high school graduate now. She's running along, and I'm traveling at the same speed as she is, and I'm tracking. So again, when you see these shots in the upper left and the upper right, these people are moving towards the camera and they're not showing motion very much. They need to be moving parallel to the film plane, is what we call it. They need to be moving across the sensor. In the lower left, very fast shutter speed, and in the lower right, a slower shutter speed. So just to draw your attention to the fact that it's going to be dangerous if you're moving fast and taking a tracking shot while looking through the camera. Don't necessarily do that. You'll trip and fall. Set up the shot, direct your subject to walk or run to a specific point, and shoot the shots without looking through your camera so you can see where you're going. Just hold your camera up and keep your eye on the subject and travel at the same speed and click, 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 take those photos so you don't walk off a curb. And if you have focused correctly, the shots will look good because as you're tracking, you're staying at the same distance from your subject. Or you could have someone lead you along while you look through the camera so you don't trip. Please be careful. So motion studies 1, 2, and 3, those assignments are due next week by Thursday at noon. That's a total of 8 shots. So again, let's review how to turn in your assignments. You send your completed assignments to me through the Canvas portal. Want to make sure that you have labeled your assignments in the way that I talked about in the first week. And I like to have your name appear on each photograph, well, on each screen. And also you'll want to show the shutter speeds and f-stops on each photo. So the assignments should be done in PowerPoint, but if the files are too big to send, just save your PowerPoint show as a PDF and then you can send that to me. That's usually small enough to go through email. So let's review the 3 screens that are due by noon next Thursday. The motion study 1, 2 photos on one screen showing different shutter speeds, a slow shutter speed and a fast shutter speed. Motion study part 2, 4 shots on one screen. For the first 2 shots on the top row, we do not move our camera. We just do a slow and a fast shutter speed. And then for the ones down below, we pan with the subject with a slow and a fast shutter speed, moving the camera to follow the subject. Motion study 3, we are tracking with the subject. We are in the lower left, it's a 500th of a second, and the photographer is moving at the same speed as the subject, and it blurs the background ever so slightly, but the subject is quite sharp. Shot 2, we're tracking with the subject, traveling at the same speed as the subject, and we use a slower shutter speed, in this case a 14th of a second. That is the assignments for the coming week. I just want to give you a little preview of what we're going to be doing in the future to keep you excited. Some of the upcoming assignments later in the course related to long shutter speeds will include motion studies with a flashlight and light painting at night, and this is a very cool effect. This is a long shutter speed at a I took this at a luau in Hawaii with fire dancers, and this was in manual mode for this long shutter speed. It was about a second long, and it allowed some real good motion. This is a shot of my oldest granddaughter. It was also done in manual mode. It was at a full second, and she's just whipping her hand around, and it's getting these light trails from the sparkler. And I also fired a flash to lighten her up and make her still. So it's a combination of flash with a long exposure. And here's another light painting example. It's really a lot of fun. This is a long exposure light painting with a flashlight. It required manual mode. It was 10 seconds, and the subjects just held as still as they possibly could, and the photographer ran around and traced them with a flashlight. It's a really great photo. And here's another light painting example. It's an extremely long exposure at night or at dusk, and the photographer painted the tree with light. Yeah, the photographer's wearing black, moving around pretty quickly. You don't see the photographer, but you see the evidence of the light striking the subject. So hang in there for the good stuff later in this class. Here's a photograph at Alabama Rocks with light painting. Okay, I hope that helps. I look forward to seeing your assignment.